All right, I think I can kick us off. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the 5th in BlueCat series of critical conversations on critical infrastructure. My name's Dana. I lead corporate communications here at BlueCat, so I get to put these on for you. It's a ton of fun. I'm going to keep the notes today pretty brief because I think we have quite a bit to get through. But before we do that, so if you've already been here, you know how this works, but if you haven't, welcome. You'll notice that this is an open Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar where we all talk at you or pretend you don't exist. That's by design. Towards the end, we'll have an open Q&A session, and we really do want you to not be shy and sort of pipe in and ask a question or make a comment here and there. That's what makes a community event a community event. So please do that. And the second thing is you'll notice that Zoom has a chat feature. And look, it's great for engaging with everyone during the conversation. You can sort of send quips back and forth. My gripe with Zoom chat is that at the end of this meeting, it closes and you can never access it again. So my recommendation, and some of you have already done this, is join the network VIP community on Slack. You'll get to interact with everyone, stay in touch after the event. Christian, who is the steward of that community, just posted a link. Free to join. And again, it's just a really good place for IT professionals like yourselves to navigate this fun career together. So with that, I am pleased to introduce to you your host for today and BlueCat's Chief Strategy Officer, Andrew Wertkin. Andrew, you want to kick us off?
Sure thing. Thank you, Dana. So I think we got a really interesting topic today, certainly one on the minds of a lot of BlueCat customers and people I speak to in general. One that's impacted BlueCat development as well as we push more and more cloud native solutions to AWS and other clouds as well. And that is just, the world of cloud service provider DNS and how that works together with enterprise DNS and what are best practices, what are customers struggling with, what pain exists, and what are some of the motivations behind that. And so joining us in this critical conversation today is my close colleague, Mr. Scott Penney. You want to introduce yourself quickly there, Scott?
Yeah, hey everybody, Scott Penney, been with BlueCat for about 6 years, currently working for Andrew, mostly focusing on, our cloud strategy and how we can adapt our products and solutions to sort of meet the needs of this new cloud world.
And joining us as well is Chris Swinford. Chris, can you introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. So Chris Swinford, Cloud Network Architect at the Kroger company on the technology and digital teams.
And Padraig O'Connor as well.
Yeah, Padraig O'Connor, Cloud Network Platform Engineer with Zurich Insurance.
Welcome to both of you. And last but certainly not least, Eyvonne Sharp.
Yeah, Eyvonne Sharp. I'm a customer engineer at Google Cloud. I help customers support them in their transformation efforts from a technical standpoint. And before that, in my former life, I was a network engineer and architect.
Does that mean you're always a network engineer and architect?
Can't get away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also you have a very cute dog behind you now. So we
I
can all
do.
watch
This
that.
is Buttons. She's going to hang out today.
All right. Well, welcome Buttons as well. Okay, so let's start with the obvious. So why are we talking about this? The importance of DNS, I think we're all aware of, but perhaps maybe some color on the inevitability of the need to use both sort of the traditional solution for DNS as well as cloud service provider DNS. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, from my perspective, a lot of times a company really gets into the public cloud through the shadow IT thing, right? Like someone gets some credits to a public cloud vendor through either a webinar or Visual Studio subscription or something. They start building something, it accidentally becomes prod, CIS, or information security becomes aware of it, and then now we need governance and we need to hook it up to the corporate network, and we need all this other reach back to our on-prem things and our data centers. And that's when cloud native starts to become a little less native. And we really need to start integrating with our own infrastructure. But at the core of it, like, how do we access things? We use our names. and how DNS is DNS, but on-prem, data center, and cloud providers, they all differ.
But I think the challenge that I've seen customers run into is they may make an assumption that I can just use my internal DNS. And so they go into their cloud systems, they change the DNS, and then some sort of cloud native service breaks. Because just like our DNS is tightly integrated into our on-premises systems, it's also tightly integrated into the cloud provider system. And they have certain mechanisms for how for service reachability via their DNS. So it's really difficult to take an either or position. You really have to figure out how to integrate your on-prem DNS with your cloud provider so that you get full reachability both in the cloud and back on-prem. So the either or approach may be how folks start, but they rarely end there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We used to feel like we had a fairly consistent goal with our customers, and that was, let's replace every other type of DNS so there's a single control plane, and now it's manageable, and it's manageable from an enterprise standpoint. And as whether it started with shadow IT or it started, in version 3, 4, or 5 in some sort of integrated state. The reality is that certainly there are cloud services that require the use. It's tightly bound to and works with a cloud service provider DNS, and so it can't simply be no, you're not allowed to use that. You have to use this, because you're taking the power of some of the cloud native solutions away, like the platform services away. That said, that doesn't mean that you should deploy the Wild West in cloud service provider DNS. And that runs into maybe some of the problems we're going to talk about today, which is just, you take the governance away from everything, and now what? Now a lot of our customers sort of retract to the before state when they had many, many different DNS servers managed by different people, where all of a sudden there's same zones all over the place for no good reason, or copy and pasted records in some places, or just a unholy network of conditional forwarding rules that are pretty hard to maintain and create failure, because names, as I think Chris said, are important, and the resolution is important.
Well, worse again, a part to consider on that one is when people start to go down that path, they start to experience a lot of pushback from your information security teams, because they have their central SIEM system that is getting all of your corporate DNS. And okay, yeah, we'll take records coming in from this one native space. That's fine. Oh, hang on, why do both of these have the same IPs? All of our reporting is based on IPs. Everyone's got the same IPs. What are we going to do? And that's where you need to consider some kind of a hybrid scenario where aspects of native work really well, but other aspects of corporate rootable are the priority for the security and compliance inside your corporation.
Well, I was thinking about security too, because DNS is such an important tool in the tool bag of our security folks, right? Blacklisting domain names, being able to manage security, the visibility of DNS records to help security teams understand if there's an ongoing threat, if there's something going on in the environment that shouldn't be, right? So DNS is also an important vector for threat hunting information too. So you have to think about that also as you're thinking about your global DNS strategy. It's not anymore just names and IPs, and those IPs are often changing. It's also how do you incorporate that service into your overall security program as well? And that's just not something that you can overlook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that gets harder and harder, of course, as you fragment DNS further and you get into multi-cloud kinds of situations, and you've got things out there that you can't necessarily control, but you still need to monitor them. And how do you get your hooks into it? Yeah, just that fragmented landscape becomes really challenging from that perspective.
No, for sure. And I think in many cases, companies try to draw boundaries between where one solution is appropriate or where another solution is appropriate. So perhaps in a cloud tenant, and I'll use that name generically for all the clouds, with the backend services of an application that speak with nothing outside of that tenant. Okay, maybe if nothing else needs to resolve that name. But if those names are being bled into the rest of the enterprise, then maybe that's when there's more of an integration. So oftentimes we see, and sort of curious from our enterprise guests, did you go through different iterations of trying to draw those lines, or was it trial and error? Like how did you approach the integration of those two domains, which I think you're both still approaching?
Strangely, we were pulled into the cloud from a BlueCat perspective. We were pulled in by Active Directory because obviously Active Directory and most of the servers out in the cloud environment are going to require to be domain joined for the authentication audit point. Now, that's fine in Azure where you have Azure AD, but when you're looking at AWS, and I actually haven't got much experience with GCP, maybe Eyvonne may be able to fill in the gaps for me there, but in AWS, they want to have Active Directory domain controllers sitting out in that environment in order to federate the domain out into the AWS area. But because their zones are authoritative on our DNS servers, we have to go out there with them. There's no real way to hybrid that kind of an approach, because if it's routable on the network and if it has security toolkit on it that requires authentication, you need to be able to resolve against an on-prem DNS server one way or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, we evolved and we continue to evolve on our strategy. We started with, I think Eyvonne mentioned this, like just simple forwarding, right? Like we start with, I've got a cloud hosted private zone and I'm going to forward everything up to that. And then you start adding some conditional forwards of, hey, this is going here and this is going here. We also started down the swim laning path, right? The fault domain isolation. And we might get into this a little later, but on the Azure side, you've got private endpoints, and those live within like a name resolution area. So now if you're, you may dedicate some DNS servers to some particular swim lane, and conditional forwarding starts to come in. So it's really been driven by need. We found that if we try to architect everything ahead of time, we're going to get something wrong. So we just try to design in a way that allows us to switch paths later, because developers can build something quickly and then tear it down and rebuild. The platform gives them that, the cloud platform. With DNS, everyone's relying on it as soon as you stand it up. So you don't necessarily get that second chance, and you need to build in that ability to change later.
Yeah, no, interesting. And I think, one of the points you just made, I think is incredibly important. And that's, we always need to think about change and how we design and architect anything these days. If we design and architect things that are difficult to change, or solutions that are difficult to change, they're going to be a problem quite soon. So I think that, how quickly can we change is a lens that any solution needs to be evaluated based on, and as opposed to here's the first thing that worked, and I think in the world of, there's not a good blueprint for this, because by the way, GCP, AWS, and Azure have very different capabilities around DNS, and company strategies of what they're deploying in these three different clouds might be quite different. The way they're routing networks might be quite different. I mean, there's all of these other factors that lead into what's the best way to approach this. That's difficult to just have like the one white paper, like here's what you do, and so we've been concentrating on trying to create a sort of normalized buffer there across, because of some of these differences. But I would imagine it's a unlike maybe network architectures of the past where you get it right and you're good for a few years, this will need to make sure continues to allow for change to facilitate the application, which is what the cloud's really about. And I think that's the other shift here from a applications need to meet the needs of the network standpoint to the application is king and the rest of the infrastructure needs to be able to flex to allow for it. So did you guys have some, were you included in the conversations sort of from the get-go on how DNS, like maybe once Shadow IT passed and how far did the cloud teams get into DNS architectures before pulling you guys in?
So I was in from the very start. We were lucky in a way because the cloud team in the company, at least back when it started, didn't have the technical capability to architect it. So the design we have in place right now is something that I architected myself and worked with the cloud architects in the business to implement. Now, much to Chris's point, that is an architecture design document that was never a fixed document. It was a working document all of the time. It is still a working document because we have to make adjustments and changes every time CSP comes out with a new functionality, and the application teams are like, yes, great, we can use this. And we're like, I don't know if you can or not. Come back to me in a month and I'll tell you whether or not we can actually use that. But I think it really does depend on the situation you're in, because an awful lot of the applications that would have pre-existed our governance of the cloud are using native DNS and will continue to use native DNS, because if we try and force corporate DNS onto them now, it's going to cause mass outages for all of their application stacks. Now, there is a requirement for them, at least from our perspective, to migrate from what we call the legacy environment into the controlled environment, but that will be managed and done through dev, UAT, and prod rather than just a force in that direction. And I think we need to be flexible in that way as well, especially with how quickly things tend to change in the environments.
Yeah, for us, I guess it depends on which cloud. So one public cloud vendor, we started using it before my tenure here. My understanding is the infrastructure teams were involved slightly, to enough where we need a DNS forwarder to forward to these native private zones, right? And that was the extent of it. It was like, we're the cloud team, here's our zone. In order to get requests to our zone, we need a forwarder. We'll build it, you forward to us. On the next cloud provider, we had a lot more input from the teams that owned DDI, like DNS and such. And that really, it made for more complexity because we put a little more thought into, the swim laning and the design and such. But yeah, it definitely, I think, resulted in fewer issues having that involvement from the get-go.
Yeah, I would imagine. And Eyvonne, do you work with enterprises as they're onboarding onto GCP to help with some of these issues? Like, do you see it from a multi-enterprise standpoint?
Yeah. So we work with all kinds of customers who are, and most of them are building out their foundational environment. And so we go through, and talk about, what they're running on-prem, what are, we tie in an identity, name resolution, all those pieces, and try to understand, what's going to make sense with their organization. Because I think, and it's not just the technical pieces too, but how are they structured? Who owns which components, right? We have to think through all of that. But I think, one of the things that we see is talking through, where's the source of authority? What zones are authoritative in which service? And let's talk about mapping all of that out. Who owns what? What are the interconnection points? How are we going to forward? How are we going to share that information? But then also understanding what services they're going to be using, and and what about migration? If you're migrating infrastructure from on-prem into the cloud, how is that different when you've got legacy hooks, whether they be DNS or on-prem services, right? So there's a lot to think through and talk through. So So yeah, and I think this is a key part of that conversation from the networking side is what are you doing today? How does that integrate? What are you doing in other cloud providers? What's the AD involvement there? You know, what's authoritative, and how do we make that work in a non-disruptive way that allows you? And I think we've heard here today a lot about being flexible, right? Because that's the name of the game in cloud services, right? You spin it up, you tear it down, and that flexibility is great. You just have to figure out how to integrate that so that everything continues to run.
Yeah, we've seen some incredibly naive and bad practices in, like, maybe it's the first shadow IT or early iteration, like exposing Amazon AWS.com internally and creating a forwarder for that to, one endpoint in one region for every single name that ends with that, regardless if they're internal, private, public, other companies, IP space, whatever the case might be, as one example of, sort of a oopsie, but, that sort of, early naive decisions. It sounds like you didn't necessarily hit that, Chris, but some of those early naive decisions that are then difficult to engineer out can also cause long-term impacts. But we've certainly seen some bad decisions made, not by the DNS people, but sort of before they were involved.
And one of the things we learned was, and this was the last couple of years, I think, was really, how it all interconnects. So our network topology influences our DNS design, right? Because we have our fault domains, and then, where does that include in the network, and where do the DNS servers go? So we went from one topology to another and suddenly needed to explode the number of DNS servers we had to minimize fault domains, as well as provide swim lane based services. So
yeah, it's the same design for us. One of the key pieces for us has been, what if we lose connectivity to on-prem? Because it's all well and good to set forwarders up and forward your DNS traffic from a Route 53 instance or an Azure DNS instance across the Direct Connect or Express route to on-premise. But the minute you lose that connection, you lose all capability in the cloud. And as I mentioned before, if a lot of your applications are dependent on authentication, your entire stack falls apart. So you need to be willing to move what looks like on-prem out into a cloud environment as well, in order to ensure that you can, at the very least, take that little hiccup, get a caching DNS server up there just to hold records for half an hour so you can return connectivity.
Yeah, and there's a misnomer in the cloud space that these conversations of failure domains and stuff maybe aren't as important. But anytime you're linking back to either resources outside of that cloud or on-prem, you still have to think about failure and where failures can happen. Now, most public cloud environments are engineered to make that more explicit. You've got your regions, you've got your zones, you've got those things defined. But when you're talking about connectivity back to on-prem, how does that connectivity happen? Where do your servers live? What are the interdependencies? And so I think the thing that I've seen too is that complexity. In some ways we reduce complexity, but in other ways we move it. And so understanding dependency mapping becomes incredibly important in that hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, whatever you want to call it, world, because you have a service failure in one place. What are all the services that run there? How do they interconnect with your services everywhere else? And DNS is a perfect example of that. If what happens if I lose access, my cloud resources may not be down, but if I can't do name resolution, well, I'm still dead in the water, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, go ahead.
So just geographically, I'm in a unique part of the world where 4 kilometers down the road, there's an entire cloud region for all of the major CSPs. And I can tell you now that in each of the CSPs, all of their availability zones are within, you could throw a stone from one to the other. So one JCB through a fiber line is going to take that entire region down. So we need to consider certain things like that. Like there is ISP redundancy, but Dublin's not a very big place, and most of our cloud colleagues are very dependent on whether it's Europe West, Europe North, or Europe Central, depending on what they're calling it. But that is where it is literally about 4 kilometers out the road.
So take your digger out and.
No, God, no.
Yeah.
Say no to those fiber-seeking backhoes, right? We don't need any of those around.
Yeah. And I think DNS is special in the case of fault domains from the following perspective. This idea of isolating a workload so you can move it around, ensuring that while you're moving that workload, you're bringing along the appropriate services so that the workload can work independently. Names bleed out from that workload. People have to access that, and names get cached all over the world, and names get and so there's a connectivity on the DNS side that I think is broader and more broader across the enterprise than other components that are packaged as part of that workload that might be moving around the hybrid cloud. So I think it's critical. So I've heard a couple of good practices that we certainly work with our customers on and certainly support, and just understanding fault domains is for sure critical. And therefore, how do we extend the on-premises DNS into the cloud so that we can ensure that there's local resolution there via one mechanism or another. We talked a little bit about how do we expose those names that are created in cloud service provider DNS back to the enterprise, the ones that need to be exposed. Again, there's a fault tolerance side on that. We'd love to think that cloud services never go down. They do, now in some cases, if a cloud service DNS went down, perhaps your application wouldn't function regardless. But certainly, and I won't call out any specific issues across the different cloud providers. There certainly have been issues, but I think fault domains in both ways is quite important, and some level of governance. I'm curious if there are rules in terms of how cloud service provider DNS can be used or should be used inside of your organizations.
So federation is a huge thing, right? Like app teams want to own as much as they can of their particular solution. So a lot of times the thing they ask is, how do I make my DNS records, right? And there are native ways, and there are, BlueCat has offerings as well for automation. But going back to governance, it's not just now a connectivity thing or a name resolution thing. It's now RBAC. It's identity and permissions. And how do I build a zone that an app team can own and then get requests to it, but then also configure it so an application team can populate it with things that, with their application names, but then not have them stomp on everyone else, right? If I have a giant Kroger zone that everyone has access to, automation doesn't always care or check to see if a record exists already. So it's federating out subzones, having consistency, and RBAC.
Yeah, no, and RBAC, and I think you bring up a point we've heard before, and which I think was excellent, which is RBAC in terms of the application, sort of going back to this idea of application as king. So we're associated with this application, and therefore we can change these records in zones where we can't change other records. It's these records are tied to us because they are part of our application, and that level of RBAC versus based on zone or based on network zone resolves to or anything else, I think is part of that sort of acknowledging the role of the application. Yeah, for sure. What about like guidelines around naming of zones, or is there how do you see what is being created in any sort of cloud service provider DNS?
I'll take the approach of, at this point, I don't necessarily care, right? So it's, if, and the reason I say that is because I'm not letting, well, it's not my zone, but people aren't building records in the primary zone. So they have a subdomain or subzone somewhere down the line, and that's their applications, right?
So but you did, whether it's officially delegated or not, it sounds like they're building their names in subzones of corporate managed zones.
Correct. Yes.
Versus creating a Kroger's local.
Right. So yeah, they are under our official domains, but they are part of maybe a second level domain under, say, Kroger, right? So, right. And then we've got a contract where the teams must build names in a certain way, and they have to, in the case of Azure, link up a zone to a particular network. Right. And we go down into our conditional forwarding fund. Right. Or GCP, do some network peerings across to the VPCs, et cetera.
Right. So you do have a set of guidelines. There's governance, even if it's in a written document, and it might be inspected or not, but you are telling those teams the basic rules of DNS from the corporation standpoint.
For sure. Right. So if we're looking, and different teams are different, and like certainly crowd operations are logged, right? So you create something, you delete something, that like the records themselves, they're logged. We may not necessarily review every single record that's created, but the zones themselves, those are really I'd say the thing that we look at before.
Right. Yeah. Good. How about at Zurich? Do you?
We haven't gotten that far yet, primarily because we need someone to accept the risk of providing that kind of access to the teams, because certain parts of our application stack require heavily on the Zurich.com DNS name, and that Zurich.com DNS name also happens to be an Active Directory domain name. So if we start to give people access in there could be an awful lot of problems around around our authentication. A large part of what I'm working on right now with Scott and with yourself on other calls is around building the automation piece to allow people to basically do what Chris has built, but through the integrity gateway in our environment. So allow them to do infrastructure as a code, allow them to have ServiceNow integration to create DNS rule or DNS names in subzones that they are responsible for. And then in that environment, from our perspective, if it is .application.zurich.cloud, whatever they put before that is on them. They could call it whatever they want. They could call it Sephiroth or, I don't know, Final Fantasy VII, or name your record.
Those were good examples.
So the risk note that you just mentioned, Padraig, is important though, right? So if you give someone the ability to make public zones under your name, right? Now you're going into DNS basics of reputation. And
so that won't happen.
Right.
That is one risk that won't be accepted.
Right.
We're only exclusively talking internal zones.
Right. But it's an important part, right? Because if you say, oh, this, anyone can create a zone, and then we're going to forward requests or we're going to make Azure DNS or GCP DNS or AWS Route 53 authoritative for, sub.kroger.com. That, the information security team and marketing and everyone else is really going to want to say in that.
Yeah. And they actually do in our environment. So you can do that, but you need to go through InfoSec. You need to go through marketing, and then marketing will raise the request to create the domain. So there is a tight ship on that one.
But it's really coming down to how much can the app team own, and then how much is shared infrastructure and needs toll gating, right? And that's different for every organization.
Yeah, and sometimes different business units within an organization. I mean, it's or are these lift and shift teams? Are these net new teams? Are these what's the reporting line in some cases? We've seen a variety of different stuff. What I hear from both of you is trying to establish process and commonality, which is fantastic. What certainly doesn't work, obviously, is a Wild West type approach. Obviously falls apart. Scott, you had a question?
Yeah, actually, that kind of leads into a question I wanted to ask there. We kind of talked about it earlier. All of these, public cloud platforms, they have different capabilities for DNS among everything else that they do. So when you're doing this work and building these architectures, they're going to cross, GCP and Azure and AWS or whatever, and you're trying to, I would assume, standardize your processes and your approach as much as you can. How do you do that when there's such widely varying capabilities? Do you go with like a least common denominator type of approach that everybody can do, or do you customize it?
So we landed on a least common denominator of like a particular subzone corresponds to a particular public cloud provider or data center or fault domain. So it's hierarchical, and you've got one zone that covers all of a particular provider, and then subzones under that always get routed to the same resolvers. And then that allows us to minimize the churn with our on-prem forwarders. So they only need to know the major zones to forward to. And then anything like application specific or line of business or what have you, those all fall under the particular cloud specific or data center specific zone. Mm-hmm. Now, the important thing there is like that allows you to build your own apps, but if you're multi-cloud, like you don't want your end users to have to remember app name .azure .whatever, app name .gcp .whatever. Yeah. So yeah, you still got your friendly names that might be GSLB fronted or something else that then CNAME over to the application.
Yeah, and those sorts of rules aren't really different than if you had a traditional ADC in front of something, right? There's the friendly name and the backend infrastructure name, and nobody outside of those managing the infrastructure really need to see that backend name.
We've very similar approach, except we're not quite as far down the path as Kroger. We are still very much, we took the option, as you guys know, to move our entire BlueCat estate out into each of the CSPs and manage it centrally still through the existing platforms, with the hope to move towards automating those tasks. Like the ServiceNow integration piece is a key piece for us that will allow, with certain governance mechanics, users to create DNS records for their relevant applications into the likes of the Zurich.com record that we want to protect. Because if it comes from something controlled like ServiceNow, there's less chance of impact on the business over something coming in via Terraform or through an Ansible playbook or any interaction like that, realistically.
Yeah, understood. Eyvonne, I was talking to one of your cloud service provider competitors who let me know that while they acknowledge the fact that enterprises might go multi-cloud, they don't acknowledge the other clouds exist and only like to think about their own cloud and solutions for their own cloud. So not to put you on the spot here, but I'm assuming that conversation comes up when you're working with enterprises. I mean, they're not, some companies obviously are putting the vast majority of cloud investment into a single player. But certainly from the BlueCat perspective, looking across our customer base, it's hard to find one that's their strategy. Everything's going to GCP or Azure or AWS. So do you deal with questions around multi-cloud as you're working with enterprises and differences between?
I mean, it certainly comes up, right? I mean, we can only speak authoritatively
Oh, for sure.
for, for our CSP and what we can do. But it's we're very aware that customers are running services in AWS or they're running services in Azure, and certainly Microsoft and AD and ADFS almost always come up in enterprise conversations around DNS. So yeah, I mean, there's an awareness there of those services. I think, what our focus is to be sure our customers have the tools that they need. I think, I've been at GCP about a year, and our cloud DNS is the only service I've ever heard of that has like 100% uptime, right? I mean, nobody ever says that about a service, and that's been interesting to see and understand. At the same time, I think as cloud adoption grows, and it is, we can't stick our heads in the sand about other services, about on-prem services, about where other customers are running resources, because they need solutions, and we can't just pretend that they're not there. So we have to talk about them, and then and that's why we all have for us, it's a marketplace where we integrate with third-party solutions to help bridge some of those gaps. We every cloud provider, I think, there are things that we do great, things that we are really good at, but then if we're being honest, there are still services that either will run in a colo or will run on-prem for a long time, and so we have to look at those things head on and come up with solutions for them. So that's my personal approach. I don't know if I'm speaking authoritatively there, but when I talk to customers, we are always talking about certainly how to balance on-prem and cloud resources, but typically they're also working with services in another CSP.
Right. Right. I mean, look, we struggle with it, trying to make sure that we're covering the CSPs appropriately with all three, with very different capabilities in some areas. So I imagine it's a struggle with enterprises, and there's companies whose strategies are out there to overlay on top of the cloud and make them look all similar across, and to allow for that multi-cloud flexibility. Also to quote unquote simplify things, but then you end up in this like, okay, great, but now I'm limited to your sandbox, and I can't really take advantage of all these cloud native services and platforms out there. We have a massive customer who's just literally painting Kubernetes all over the place, and they won't use really anything that can't be deployed in a Kubernetes cluster, and that's it. Everything else is abstracted through that. We see these different strategies for that, but just from a pure play visibility on the enterprise DNS side, we hear over and over and over again of just sort of the pain of understanding what's going on there, if it's not managed completely through process. One of the other things we always struggle with on the DNS side as DNS practitioners is this idea that it's always DNS. Something goes wrong, and the clock starts ticking, and an hour and a half later you realize there was a DNS issue, and not necessarily DNS downtime, but a problem with a glue record or a forwarder, or something isn't right, and leading to just how DNS works with caching and everything else, just leading to just this bizarre set of outages across the company. So curious, the panel, like, is there I think from a security standpoint, either Chris or Padraig brought it up before, but how do you think about getting the operational data you need across these different systems to ensure that the service is behaving the way it should behave, and that you can solve for issues that might come up?
So I don't have a good answer other than observability is, everyone's favorite thing over the last year or so. So we are working toward, how do we monitor these things? both the cloud side and our traditional DNS servers, right? Because how do you monitor a global service that should be up all the time?
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer for that one.
Right.
Poorly.
Yeah.
Poorly tends to be the right answer.
Yeah.
No, we probably don't use the tools that are on offer as effectively as we should. I know there are certain aspects of DNS Edge, for example, from BlueCat that are very in-depth monitoring tools as regards DNS security. But see, the problem you have is when you have tools like that are on offer and they're new to a platform, to a DNS platform, you're competing with the existing monitoring platforms that are in place. For example, Splunk, which is what we use. And it becomes hard to compete in that scenario because you have a cyber team. The DNS team are not really equipped to monitor that 24/7. We've enough hassle trying to actually keep the environment up to date. But then you have the security team who are responsible for monitoring far more than just DNS. So having one pane of glass for DNS and one pane of glass for everything else just doesn't fly, unfortunately. There needs to be one pane of glass for everything. And that's where you start to run into issues. It gets a little bit easier, potentially, on slightly less scaled environments, potentially, because you're not looking at as many logs. But I know in our scenario, we generate terabytes of logs a week.
Yeah, no, right. No, for sure. And look, I mean, our like well, in general, what I think vendors need to do in that scenario is one, ensure the data ends up where the company needs it. And so if that's in Splunk or whatever SIM tool they use, then the data needs to end up there as well. It all comes down to value, and so like, what one of the things that and very specifically don't want to make this critical conversation about BlueCat, but this is just how I feel about software in general. Like, we should prove that we're bringing you insights into that data, whether it's on the security side or the health of the service side, that are valuable. And with that value comes, okay, well then we're going to put this stuff in SIM, and we're also going to use this for analyzing it as well. And if we can demonstrate that we can, find potential DNS misconfigurations or outages before your users do, well, there's value, and so our strategy has always been around not assuming we're going to be a better SIM, because we're not a SIM, than Splunk, but that we can, given our domain expertise, can provide more value there. And we approach it in a collaborative way with our customers. But so having said that, yeah, look, it's there's obviously a lot of value on the security side for DNS, and certainly on the compliance side. But on the application performance side, on the, you move stuff to cloud and lift and shift, and it ends up that applications had some massive dependency on DNS, where the application was querying DNS and bypassing the stub resolver and querying it 100 times a second, and you just added 50 milliseconds of latency in that path, and now you've got a performance issue. Good luck finding that. And so we're trying to provide some of that tooling as well. But regardless, I just think just to go back to the topic we touched to begin with, the one of the core differences here, besides the fact that developers now have the ability to do a bunch of the stuff themselves that maybe they didn't before, is just how rapidly the stuff changes. And so, yeah, from an observability standpoint, you need to know what's going on so you can predict.
Just really quickly to clarify, Andrew, I just want to make sure I didn't come across the wrong point there. Your tooling is legitimately the best tooling that is possible, because you're coming at Splunk. Splunk is a platform that's for everything. You're coming at this as a subject matter expert company that are responsible for DNS. You're going to see stuff that is going to make the DDI team's life as easy as possible. For example, if we give access to the response policy, I know we're running short on time, but if we give access to the response policy for someone to create private endpoint records to allow them to resolve private endpoints on-prem, I don't expect Splunk to see that they've created www.google.com in that response policy, but I would expect your tooling to see it, and your tooling will see it immediately because you'll have monitors in place. And the benefit of your tooling as well is using functionality like the integrity gateway. Your tools can actually go back in and fix that immediately instead of waiting for an engineer to get a phone call to log in. The tools that are monitoring tools built by DNS engineers for DNS systems are always going to beat the broader monitoring tools like Splunk or SolarWinds or any of that other stuff, because they don't have the same integrations. And that to me is very important. But unfortunately, when it comes to larger organizations, the DNS team are not the people looking at the logs.
Yeah.
It's very hard to win that battle. As much as I tried, I honestly did.
Yeah, yeah, no, understood. And I didn't take it any other way. So what? And maybe I'll ask all three of this question. So, what advice can you give, enterprises today as they look at DNS integration as part of their cloud strategy?
I'll
I don't think I once referred to our list of questions, so you could have been.
That's fine. No, I mean, I think what I would tell customers is first think architecturally, understand your dependencies, right? Where are your services? Where do they run? Who accesses them? And how they need to interact with one another. I mean, I think like if you can get there, you can get a lot further down the road, but think architecturally and understand like it's not, it doesn't just work. And I think that's I'm probably preaching to the choir saying that in this audience, but it's an important problem to be solved. And also to understand the nature of the services your application teams are going to be using, and then understanding how they work, and don't assume that they work like they do on-prem or they work like they did in the last cloud provider. Because I think a lot of what we continue to do is education, that like, this is how it works here. This is how to think about it here, and not make assumptions. And then what we've heard already is be prepared for things to change. I think
for sure. And yeah, you're definitely preaching to the choir on the architecture side, but I hope everybody hears that loud and clear. I think the opportunity in cloud to locally optimize and not think about the broader architecture is massive, but in general, we should always be thinking about the architecture. Yep.
Something that we're learning the hard way, just to expand on that point, is you need to look as the subject matter expert for your DDI environment. You need to go and you need to look at what it's like to walk into a greenfield CSP and all of the capability that you can have as an application owner in the greenfield CSP, because when they come to you looking to deploy DNS, they're looking for that capability. They're not looking for the corporate DNS to be put out into the cloud.
Right. So understand what's available there and how it's used. Understand your new customer.
Yep.
Yeah. We're all in the business of connecting things, whether you're a network engineer, DDI, whatever. And, Eyvonne's point of who are your clients and what services are you providing and how do you connect them up? So, where do the clients live? How do they need to consume these services? How do your application teams need to publish those services, and then work your way back from there? Again, think architecturally. I like that.
Yeah. No, all good points. And part of why we created this network VIP community and why we do this critical roundtables is just to connect our customers and our non-customers and people in the industry together to share best practices. Because I think from my experience, people do a lot of listening to either the cloud service provider or the big brand consultant that was hired to help you in this journey to the cloud, and not enough peer-to-peer. And this stuff is all new enough that there's not enough wisdom out there. There's not 20 years of best practices, and there couldn't be, because then things change under you. So, it's been wonderful at BlueCat being able to have these constant conversations with customers. Really helps us in what we're trying to do. But I'm just in general, speak to your peers. I would add that as well, and learn from your peers. Great. Are there questions from those that have joined or that are on Network VIP that I missed, and this is when I look at Dana.
We've got one question that David Muscat asked, but it's more a question for everybody. And so, if you've got time after this roundtable, I just encourage you to go in there and take a look at it. Otherwise, if nobody here...
Well, I see you asked me a question about private endpoints.
I did.
Which didn't come up really once, but this is like this is a constant issue in customer base, given the different CSPs and their DNS conventions around private endpoints, their routing conventions around private endpoints, their differing strategies of should you have a common VPC or VNet for those said private endpoints or distribute them around. How should that actually work? Seems to be a common issue across, and I don't even know what I'm assuming that's the case at Zurich and Kroger.
Yeah, it's a very complicated topic. We've come up with a method of dealing with them in Azure. That method is by using binds or PZ functionality in BlueCat and actively configuring each private endpoint on premise. So, well, to be honest, it actually works out really well, because it means not only is it resolving inside the VNet, it's also resolving all over the network in all of the VNets, which is something that ironically Azure DNS is not actually built to do, because if you have more than one account, in order to do their solution, you need to route your DNS through both accounts. And you can't do that. That's not functionally possible. Whereas this solution lets everyone on the network resolve those private endpoints regardless of where they are. However, when you start looking at AWS, those private endpoints are s3.amazonaws.com in every VPC.
Yeah. Depending on, I think, their interface or gateway type. So yeah, it's also another example where this whole idea of private endpoints, and for those that I probably should have defined them real quickly, but basically endpoints on private IP addresses for cloud platform services, so that you're not routing out through the internet to access them. For instance, a database as a service provided within one of your accounts, within one of your networks. Those get a name. And yeah, AWS has two different categories of those. Some with very, you don't have a choice, and some where you have a choice. A common issue for sure. And, one where, again, I hear the cloud service provider sort of changing strategies over time with those as well, but one that's always a stickler on the DNS side.
Something that we haven't mentioned too much through the call, but there is also the relevant capability of, even in the cloud team, there's friction on these discussions, because most people who are deploying into the cloud bring contractors in, external contractors, and those external contractors are used to using the likes of Route 53 to do this kind of stuff. And when you start to tell them, oh, but our DNS is a corporate DNS service, that's not going to work, and you end up in some very long phone calls that no one wants to be in. Trying to explain to them that that's great, but I don't have the authority to let you go around our DNS policy.
Yeah, and that's the you can locally optimize anything, but these are large enterprises, and you don't have the opportunity just to locally optimize.
Guys, we are at the top of the hour. I know some people have a hard stop, so thanks so much for anyone who does need to drop right now, and being mindful of some of our panelists as well. If anybody does want to stay on, I don't know, Scott or Andrew, if you guys have to go, but we could stay on for another couple of minutes, or if anything, just take your questions and continue the conversation in Slack or on the next roundtable. But
And thank you, obviously the panelists, but everybody who joined as well. Look, this is a difficult topic because it's emerging, and given the different clouds and the different ways people deploy cloud, there's not common solutions. We at BlueCat are very focused on ensuring the connectivity, ensuring the visibility, ensuring a commonality of how we're going to use this, such that DNS remains whole. And that can mean very different things to different enterprises. So certainly for our customers and others, I encourage more conversations, so that we can navigate this together. Thank you all.
We will share a recording with all of you in the near future, as well as a blog summary for anybody who's interested. But I think this is the first time and the closest to actual scheduled end time that we are wrapping up.
That's because John didn't ask any questions.
I'm holding my tongue about automation and programmability. It's just such a wonderful panel. I was trying to do more listening and learning today than asking and speaking. But if they have any parting thoughts about, are they using Go or Python, or are they using domain-specific languages as a parting thing? I'd love to hear it. I'm not going anywhere.
I knew I
can certainly talk into what we're doing if that's what people want around, because specifically the biggest problem we have is it's all well and good to be configuring all those private endpoints. But when you introduce a 3-day SLA to something that's supposed to come up and solve a problem immediately, you start to run into issues. We're looking at using Python and the Integrity Gateway to solve our problems in that one. Although I have run into a bit of a roadblock. I think Scott has an email from me somewhere buried away. So those kind of solutions are the direction we kind of want to start going in. And at the top of the call, before the call started, I mentioned certain applications like Palo Alto have Cortex XOR, which is going to be used fairly aggressively by an awful lot of enterprises, including our own, for automating our cloud stack, whether it be for Palo Alto rules, BlueCat entries. Ironically enough, for Palo Alto, they also allow you to integrate for the native firewalling and the native tooling. So that is a very powerful piece of kit that requires the functionality to be there, because ultimately, if you are, that's the best way of putting this, you don't want to be the weak point in the automation stack, because if you're the weak point in the automation stack, you're going to be replaced.
Yeah. Remove friction, right? That's the thing I always hear.
Yeah.
The idea of cloud, right?
Yep.
Make it go fast.
Well, I need to drop. So I'm going to bid you all a fair adieu and thank you again. All right. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks again. That was great. And Dana, thanks for hosting these again. It's nice to see you. Congratulations, by the way, before I leave. I just wanted to say that to you.
Thank you. Love hosting these and putting these together. Yeah, if anyone's got questions, comments, just want to chit chat, or you've got a suggestion for a topic or anything like that, you can reach us either through NVIP Slack or at marketingteam@bluecatnetworks.com. I'm always curious to see what you guys want to hear next and who you want to hear from next. Chris, Padraig, Scott, thanks a bunch. See you around.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Bye.
Hey guys. Bye-bye.